I think we can all agree that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is highly divisive, contentious, and polarizing. If you don't agree with this, maybe this video is not for you. I've thought a lot about this over the last 2 years. And I don't think it's getting any better. I think we can agree after the horrific events of October 7th and the horrific atrocities that have followed by both Hamas and the IDF that we're not getting to a place where people are having civil dialogue, or we're not getting any closer to that place. I've thought a lot about this because I don't see a solution to this conflict without a mutual recognition of the humanity of the other side. I see lots of labels that are thrown around, lots of self-identifiers and assumptions baked into each of those self-identifiers. And two thoughts that two things that I've just wanted to discuss for a while I've had on my mind. And this is going to be somewhat informal today, so I apologize if I'm kind of stumbling over my own speech, but is the two things of Zionism and its opponent, anti-Zionism, right? We have these two ideas because these are loaded terms. In today's dialogue and political debate and polarized world, one can be a Zionist and you can be just and a lover of Jews and simultaneously being viewed as an oppressor, a supporter of genocide, a supporter of apartheid, or any number of horrific things. And one can be an anti-Zionist and see somebody who is anti-oppression, who is for self-determination of Palestinians, but simultaneously be viewed as an Islamist, a terrorist, an anti-Semite. And I don't think that either of those are really right. That debate doesn't necessarily help things. And as a historian, I feel the need to go back to history to look at where these things emerge from. And because you can't have an anti before you can have a something, so we're going to talk about Zionism, and then we're going to talk about the emergence of anti-Zionism. Now, to be clear, before I get into these two things, I do not really ascribe to either of these labels. When it comes to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I don't have many strong opinions. I'm not a two-state, I'm not a one-state, but I am somebody who believes that all people should have equal rights. They should have freedoms, there should be protections, and I believe in the humanity of both Jews, Zionists, Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, etc., however you want to define this conflict. So that's at the core of what my ethos is. So let's get to Zionism and what it is, and then we'll talk about anti-Zionism. And is it really just anti-Zionism, or is it something a little bit different? Zionism is actually pretty simple, and I don't think we really talk about this enough in the conflict. We just say, oh, they're a Zionist, they're not a Zionist, and we immediately go with our preconceived notions about what those things mean. Zionism in and of itself is just Jewish nationalism. Nationalism, if you don't know, if you're not a social scientist, and it's one of those things that's also often misunderstood, even though it's not that complex. Nationalism is at its core, according to many historians and people who debate what nationalism is, and I should acknowledge that there are many competing definitions, but generally speaking, nationalism would be the idea that for a people that comprises a distinct group, this can be ethnic, it can be religious, it can be a civil type of nationalism, you can have a civil definition of what it means to be people. We can put other ones in there as well. But nationalism is the idea that if we have a people, that the state should represent those people. So let's talk about something today. People talk a lot about Christian nationalism in the United States. The idea of Christian nationalism would be basically that the state should be based on the ideas and the identity of Christianity, the Christian identity. Now, that can be tricky because who's a Christian? Are Mormons Christian? Are Catholics Christian? Are Seventh-day Adventists Christian? That's not something all Christians agree upon, so you might get a debate. Jehovah's Witnesses, you could throw it in there. But that at its core would be like Christian nationalism, that the state should be based on Christianity, should privilege Christians above others. So Jewish nationalism is this basic idea that Jews comprise a people. It makes total sense in the 19th century in Europe, where Zionism emerged. Nationalism was kind of the flavor. We're seeing the creation of the state of Italy, the state of Germany is created. They're both based out of kind of these ethnic nationalisms that are floating around. And many Jews in Europe are debating whether or not we fit into this framework of being Italian or being French or being German, and Jews weren't entirely in agreement. But there were many Jews who basically said, we're never going to be accepted in this community. And we have experienced tremendous amount of suffering, and especially in the late 19th century with the pogroms in Russia and a lot of the anti-Semitism that's floating around in Russia, the determination is basically, we do comprise the people, and the only way to be safe is to create a Jewish homeland, to create a Jewish state. Like, we'd argue that a Christian or an Italian state or a German state was necessary. So we have to create the state. And this is the impetus that would eventually lead to the creation of the State of Israel. Now, most of the supporters of the Zionist movement were Jews, but there were also Christians who saw this in dispensational Christianity as fulfillment of prophecy. That's neither here nor there. But that at its core is what Zionism is. Now, it should be mentioned that Zionism has many different flavors as well, just as Christian nationalism does, and just as nationalism does, and Christian nationalism. Because there's a whole lot of debate in there for what Jews are, but also how do you achieve the goals of a nationalist movement? So for Zionists, how do you achieve these goals? Now, the term anti-Zionism really doesn't come around till much later. And so let's go into the mindset of the early Zionists, and we'll get to anti-Zionism in a little bit. So early Zionists were, by and large, European Jews, many of them secular, not all, who saw returning to the land of Palestine and colonizing it. They were from Europe. This is a place where colonialism was common, even when it's justified in terms of the mission civiltrice or like the white man's burden, as we see in Britain. These are, pretty common ideas. So they saw themselves in many respects as European colonists that were out to basically do what Europeans were doing and what the British were doing in India, or what the French were doing in Algeria at the same time. But they saw it as a righteousness. They had a moral attitude that was tied to this, that really privileged their own plight and own position above anybody else. And so before I move on, I'm just going to share a quick quote from the Israeli historian Benny Morris. This comes from the conclusion of his book, Righteous Victims, which covers the Israeli-Palestinian conflict up until about 2001. And in the conclusion, he's discussing the reasons for the emergence of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And he says, one reason, by the way, undoubtedly was the routine European colonists' mental obliteration of the natives. Colonists tended to relate to natives as part of the scenery, objects to be utilized when necessary, and not as human beings with legitimate rights or aspirations. The Zionists were intent on politically or even physically dispossessing and supplanting Arabs. Their enterprise, however justified in terms of Jewish suffering and desperation, was tainted by a measure of moral dubiousness. And here comes my issue. When I said at the beginning, why would I not ascribe to being a Zionist? And here comes my challenge, or my biggest reason, is I feel many Zionists today privilege the sheer goal of the Zionist movement to be the most important moral. There is no other morality here. Jewish suffering is privileged always above any other suffering. And therefore, it makes it almost impossible to come to some kind of an understanding of what they've been doing. Look at the way Benny Morris terms how early Zionists in Palestine were operating. He says they viewed the natives as part of the scenery, objects to be utilized when necessary, and not as human beings with rights or legitimate aspirations. How many of you feel like if you were treated that way, if you were part of a group, you might not be willing to resort to violence? It's not to justify the violence you would resort to, or the violence that Palestinians have used at times, but it helps you understand how this conflict emerged. And Palestinians similarly have placed their suffering at the center of the discourse. Now let's get to the anti-Zionists. Because here's my issue with the Zionism. Absolutely, I can completely understand why Jews need a state. I can completely understand why you would want a Jewish state and how that would make you feel safer. But the necessity of a Jewish state does not give you carte blanche to do what you want for 75 years against a population that you are displacing. And it's important to note that Zionists today, not all of them, but many of them say, oh, we should have all of the land. We should ethnically cleanse all of these people. That's not all of them, but there are some even in the Israeli government. So today when we look at anti-Zionists, I don't think most anti-Zionists would say, I am totally against the existence of a Jewish state. Some would. But I think most of them are saying, I'm just against the state of Israel, that in many respects has carried out policies that continue to privilege Jews against Arabs. And they are willing to do it regardless of morality, because in their mind, the morality, the only morality that counts, is the preservation and expansion of Jewish sovereignty in the land. And that is where I struggle, because until both Palestinians and Israelis can recognize their mutual humanity, can recognize that each has to sacrifice and compromise for peace, there won't be peace. And so I have a hard time being an anti-Zionist because I don't believe in the destruction of the state of Israel. I'm not against a Jewish state. I am not. But that state, like any other state, whether it's Syria or whether it's Russia or the United States, still must apply and still operate under international law, over common ideas of what it means to be human and to respect humanity. And therein lies my challenge. My challenge personally when I try to wade through this conflict. And I hope this discussion gives you a little bit of help in kind of understanding these things, but if it doesn't, I at least hope you enjoyed the 12 minutes you've been